Let's talk about the key elements of cardiorespiratory fitness. The main way you're going to improve your cardiorespiratory fitness is through aerobic training. So you may have done this through group fitness classes like kickboxing or boot camp. Those are almost all interval based, where you get really high heart rates and drop down to a lower heart rate, and you keep repeating that cycle. Eventually, over time, you lengthen the amount of time that you're at the high heart rate and shorten the amount of time that you're at the lower heart rate. Indication of a strong heart is increased size of the left ventricle, because that's the part of the heart that pumps out blood to the rest of the body. Increased stroke volume, increased cardiac output. So if you take heart rate times stroke volume, that equals cardiac output. So how efficient is the heart at pumping blood? And we're not just talking about the cardiovascular system, we're also talking about the respiratory system. So how efficient are your lungs at gas transfer? And it's really the uptake of oxygen. Can we get oxygen out to the tissue, or get oxygen into the bloodstream so it can eventually get to the tissue? And we're also talking about expiration of CO2 and the alveoli. And that's where the gas transfer happens, is those little sacs within the little round sacs within the lungs. The aerobic oxidative energy system is our main energy system that we're using for cardiorespiratory activities. And so you can use fats, carbs, and protein as your fuel source, but your body's most efficient at using carbohydrate to generate your ATP. So as long as the activity is not too intense, and anything that's continuous and repetitive over 2 minutes could primarily use the aerobic oxidative energy system to generate ATP. The byproducts of cellular respiration, you have CO2, which if left in the body would increase acidity, but since we expire it, it helps get rid or reduce acidity. And then we have H2O, which we expire and helps cool the body through sweat. Macronutrients as an energy are used as energy. So if you've ever heard of somebody running a marathon and hitting the wall, what's happened is they've used all their carbohydrate stores within the body. They can still run, they're just not going to be as efficient because they start tapping more into fat, and that requires more oxygen. And so they get extremely exhausted and lethargic. And so if you're going to run a marathon, a lot of times what athletes will do is they'll carb load before an event so that we can store more carbohydrate within the body, or more glucose within the body, so they can use it as an energy source. So it all depends on how intense an activity is. We can tap into fatty acids, free fatty acids. So if the intensity is not too high, and this is just a general term, this is not exact, but it'll give you a rough idea of what I'm talking about. If I go for a walk, the body says, okay, this is not too intense. Let's use fats as our energy source, and we'll use some carbohydrate. So it starts using the free fatty acids because the energy demand is not as great. And so maybe about 75% of my calories are coming from fat, and another 25% are coming from carbohydrate. Whereas if it's extremely intense, or maybe I start off running really fast, the body's like, we need energy now. And so it goes after the blood sugar. And so the majority of the energy I'm burning is coming from carbohydrate, from glucose. So maybe 75% of that activity, since it is intense, I might be burning 75% carbohydrate and 25% fat. That's just a rough idea. That's not exact, but it gives you an idea of what I'm talking about when it comes to intensity and the fuel source being used. The Atkins diet, you may have seen that, where people just take in protein and fat. It was developed for cardiac patients that couldn't exercise, and it does work. They limit the carbs, but there are some side effects. Your brain runs off glucose, and so you need carbohydrates. So a lot of people that are on these diets, if there aren't enough carbohydrates taken in, they often feel lethargic, and it's hard for them to think. And so over time, eventually they start having to eat carbohydrate. And other side effects is people have developed gallstones. So there's a higher incidence of gallstones in people that are on the Atkins diet. So VO2 max is how efficient a person is at using oxygen, so over time. So how efficient is your body at getting oxygen out to the tissue per minute? So the average person, 35 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. That's average for most people. And it does change with age and gender, but that's average for most people. So as you do a lot of cardiovascular exercise, you start to improve your VO2 max. So somebody like Lance Armstrong was at 88 mLs per kg per minute. So it's really high. He's getting a lot of milliliters of oxygen out to the tissue per minute. He may not be the best example because he was blood doping, but the highest ever recorded VO2 max was by a cross-country skier, and that was 92 mLs per kg per minute. Because not only are you using your lower body and you're at high altitude, it's just a super aerobic sport. O2 deficit. Anytime that we train, there's not enough oxygen in the system, and we create a little bit of a deficit when we first start working out. And so the anaerobic system has to kick in when there's not enough oxygen to go around. And that's mainly based on intensity. And then you have anaerobic threshold versus lactate threshold. A lot of people get these confused and they think that they're the same thing, which they're not. So the anaerobic threshold is the point at which the anaerobic system has to kick in to help out the aerobic system. So if I start running, and it's all based on intensity, and the intensity is too high for the aerobic system to maintain or produce energy, then the anaerobic system has to kick in and start supplying some energy needs. Eventually I'll have to slow down, but if I stay there long enough and the intensity is high enough, I'll reach my lactate threshold, and the lactic acid in the bloodstream will increase exponentially after that point, and I'll have to stop. The intensity is just too high, too much lactic acid builds up, I get fatigued, and I will have to stop. So those two are not the same, because you can kick into your anaerobic system first, or anaerobic threshold may be reached first, and then you'll reach your lactate threshold. So they are different. So METs, metabolic equivalent. You may see this on some treadmills. It can be used to determine your VO2 max. So there's, for 1 MET equals 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. So if you were at 10 METs, that's 35 mLs per kg per minute. That would mean that you have, or you're working at a rate for the average person. You'd have an average VO2 max at that rate. Then we have high altitude training. Has several benefits for cardiorespiratory exercise. It increases mitochondrial density, so more mitochondria within the cell. It increases red blood cell concentration within the blood. You increase capillary innervation within the tissue. And you can now do this using barometric tents. They're expensive, but you have to be at an altitude of 9,000 or above to reach all the benefits of high altitude recovery. So the old notion was live high, train low. So you still train at sea level, but when you do your rest and recovery, you want to do it at altitude, and you'll get these benefits. And there were very few places in the world where we could do that. And that's why our Olympic Training Center was in Colorado Springs, because they could get down to sea level or close to sea level and train and get the athletes back up to altitude to recover. And there's also some benefit for training at altitude as well. Red blood cells. We have hemoglobin. There's 4 locations for oxygen to bind. That's how we deliver oxygen to the tissue, or how we get O2 out to the tissue. Mitochondrial density. The reason that's important is because the mitochondria are the aerobic powerhouse of the cell. That's where aerobic oxidation takes place. So the more we have, the more of an aerobic machine we are. Interval training. That's the best way to do your cardio. Get really high heart rates. It'll improve your anaerobic threshold, your lactate threshold, your VO2 max, your buffering capacity. And so, just like I said in an earlier slide, you try to maximize the time that you're at that high heart rate and then shorten the amount of time that you're at the lower heart rate. And that will eventually improve recovery. So recovery heart rate is the amount of time in between exhaustive intervals. So you get that exhaustive bout of exercise, then you drop down to a lower heart rate, and it's the amount of time for your heart to get down to that lower heart rate after that exhaustive exercise. And so the faster that happens, less energy you will burn, and the more efficient you'll be with your energy sources. Muscle pump. This is important for a proper cool down. So what happens is, and maybe your coach has told you, you always want to continue walking after you run because there's these huge muscles in the lower body. And the heart has to, if you just suddenly stop, the heart has to pump really hard to help assist the blood coming back from the extremities to the heart. And if it has a hard enough time, you could pass out from that. So if you continue to walk around after you work out or after you run, it'll help assist and get blood back to the heart. And here's how they work. So these are the muscles, and every time they contract, they squeeze on these veins. These veins have a series of one-way valves. The blood is forced up, but it can't go back down, and these muscles squeeze on those veins and help assist the blood back to the heart. So you really need to make sure that you have a good cool down after explosive bouts of exercise. Don't just suddenly stop, because then you lose the assistance of the muscle pump. So for the skill today, we're going to learn how to find out our estimated max heart rate and set training zones. This is extremely important for cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory exercise. So you take 220 minus your age. So let's say it's a 20-year-old person. That means their estimated max is going to be 200. And then you take that estimated max and multiply it by 0.80. That's to find your upper limit. That'll give us 160. Then I take that same 200 again, multiply it by 0.70, which is 70%. That'll give us our lower limit, which is 140. So we want to train in between 160 and 140. That's how it's used. That way we're not training too hard and we're not training too easy.